Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Friday. It is time for another installment of Romance in Modern Mythology. So we're going to be looking at the relationship of Edward Elric and Winry Rockbell, and of course, as always, forgive me as I refer to my notes. I try not to get my thoughts too scatterbrained in these videos. So, we are going into the world of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, which is an anime series, and it's set in the fictional country of Amestris. In this world, alchemy is a science, and it's a source of major military power in the country of Amestris. Other countries have different forms of alchemy, but it's really alchemy and alchemy that you see featured within the show itself. Now, alchemy operates on the principle of equivalent exchange. So in order to create something, something of equal value must be given in exchange. Now, Edward Elric and his younger brother Alphonse, they were both badly injured in an alchemy procedure that was intended to bring their mother back from the dead. In the course of this, Ed lost both his arm and his leg, and poor Alphonse, he was actually a disembodied soul that Ed just managed to bond to a suit of armor. Both are prodigies in alchemy, and Edward joined the Amestris military to get the resources necessary to figure out how to restore their bodies using another alchemical procedure. This is called being a state alchemist. They are very well paid, they have a privileged and important position within society, and even though he joined the military when he was all of 12, he essentially came into it with the rank equivalent to that of a military major. So that gives you some frame of reference for just the degree of respect and power and authority that a state alchemist would have. Now, Winry Rockbell, she was a childhood friend of both of their brothers. Her family were very close neighbors to theirs. Her parents were killed in a civil war between Amestris and Ishvals. They were doctors, and they died while they were treating patients. Winry and her grandmother run what's called an automill business. An automill is a form of technology that will replace limbs for amputees. Winry designed and actually made Ed's artificial limbs, so she was his mechanic, his friend, and, well, she was just always there. They were always part of each other's psyches. There was never a point in time in their lives in which they were not interacting and connected in some way. So through the show, essentially what we're watching is the trope of friends to lovers, only it's actually done right, which is actually quite rare in most storytelling. Usually when I see the beginnings of this trope, I groan. I groan a lot because it's that one person, and one person is just having a crush on their next door bestie who doesn't really know they're alive or doesn't think of them in that way, and they're not really connected and they're not really communicating, and that at the end of the story the other person looks around, sees them there, and realizes that they were the one who they loved all along. It's horrible! It's horrible! I absolutely hate it! It's actually, that was essentially the dynamic that we were told to accept in another animated series, Avatar: The Last Airbender. That essentially it was Aang pining away for the girl who he always knew was the one, and he just hoped and hoped, and eventually she gave in, and it really falls flat. And that's usually where the friends to lovers trope goes. It's just icky. You don't see the actual friendship. You don't really see the developing dynamic. You don't see the communication and building patterns of behavior, of teamwork and working together and everything else. You just don't see it. But in Full Metal Alchemist, between Ed and Winry, you do see it. You actually see a journey to where they start knitting themselves together, and it happens very organically and very naturally. In fact, both Ed and Winry, they had mastered the art of bickering like an old married couple before either of them had actually thought of dating each other. It was just that kind of push and pull, ebb and flow, give and take dynamic that always existed between them ever since they were very small children. In fact, one of the supporting characters, Major Hughes, who was much beloved by the fandom, he was always a happily married family man, and he was always nagging others to follow his example. And at one point in the story, he was actually actively annoying Ed, and he declared that one day Winry would make Ed a fine wife, and how wonderful that was. And of course, at this stage, Ed and Winry weren't really consciously thinking of each other in that way, even though you could see, the beginning groundwork to where it would make sense for them to eventually go on a journey of that kind. But it's after this stage that we start seeing them actually getting closer. Winry is a supporting character, so she's not always part of the main action, but there is something about her that is just omnipresent, and she's omnipresent because she's always in Ed's thoughts. Now, one of the incidents involving them that was pretty significant, the pregnant woman went into labor. No one could get, she couldn't be brought to a doctor due to inclement weather. Someone had to go fetch it, and while they were waiting on the doctor to arrive, Winry had to take charge of the entire delivery process. And everyone was freaking out, but she's the one who pulled it together and started thinking back to those medical textbooks that had belonged to her parents that she'd been reading ever since she was a little kid. And Ed is the one who actually said that Winry was the best chance for the mother and child to both survive, and that the only thing they could do was defer to her knowledge and judgment until the doctor came. And ultimately, Winry and everyone else helped all together deliver the baby. And it was this really very moving thing. And it showed a part of their dynamic that doesn't always get shown with couples, the point where the guy is actually truly out of his depth, not because of, modern affectations of trying to make men look weak and pointless and hopeless. Quite the reverse. Ed has a supreme competency in many areas, but this area just was not part of his skill set. And it wasn't really part of Winry's skill set, but she was familiar with the overall process. She had studied things that her parents had studied in order to qualify for their professions. She herself was in a kind of medical adjacent profession because she was an automail engineer. So, bringing life into the world, sustaining life, making life better, this is all part of what she does, part of her mindset. And you actually see Ed, get out of her way and rally the rest of the troops into rallying behind her. And it's really beautiful to see that kind of teamwork when it's real and genuine, and it's not about one character appearing at disadvantage in comparison with the other. They're still on an equal plane. Ed was not lowered by acknowledging Winry's expertise. And very few stories actually manage that. So we have to really give credit where full credit is due. Now, after the death of Hughes, which was just horrific and devastating, and it's still too soon to talk about it, even years after the fact, this was the same one who said that Winry would one day make Ed a fine wife. They were essentially sort of colleagues in the military, but he was a good friend and ally to all of the main characters. So when he died, it hit everyone absolutely horrifically, including Winry. She had actually gotten to know Hughes and his wife and their young daughter on one of her previous visits to the capital. They'd all become fast friends. The daughter had just immediately adopted Winry as a de facto big sister. She just fell in with that family. She just fit right in with that crowd. Ed's crowd, by the way. So after this became known to them, because Ed and Al were not immediately informed, and Winry only found out about Hugh's death when she stopped to pay a call on the family. But after it became known, Ed really went out of his way to check up on her, make sure she was taken care of, and when she needed it, he just sat, talked with her, listened to her, really there in a form of mutual support, because he was suffering with the death of Hughes's too. But he was also, Ed is very much someone who the way he manages his emotions is about, okay, something horrible has happened, what do I do now? And not so much of how do I suppress this emotion and make it go away, but how do I confront it, how do I deal with it, how do I improve the situation? And it's actually a pretty healthy reaction. And because he had that reaction, I think he was so busy looking after everyone else is that it was only really with Winry that he got that mutual support back then. And it wasn't because he was, talking about how he felt about Hughes or anything of that kind. It was just that she was there and they were sharing a moment, and he was understood. And they do understand each other. Another striking incident in their development was after a stage when Edward and Alphonse, they renewed their commitment to restore their bodies to normal. And as they were, walking away, well, running away, really, could go on to the next stage of their mission, Winry was watching them go, and she was just all eyes on Edward. And she found herself just looking at him in a different way than she'd really looked at him consciously before. And she was wondering, has his shoulders always been so broad? A very interesting expression, is particularly coming from a female directed at a male. What it means is that by noticing, the broadness of the shoulders, it isn't about physical growth. It's about the fact that she was noticing his internal strength, his competency, his drive, his sense of responsibility, the passion that he had for his commitments. These are traits that make for a very desirable male partner and that strikes the female psyche in a very strong and powerful way. Now, the next incident I would like to mention is when one of the main antagonists, at least up to a certain point in the story, by the name of Scar, he was an Ishvalan, he was attacking Edward. Edward was actually trying to capture some other baddies by attracting Scar's attention. But through one reason and another, Winry ended up getting into the middle of that fight. And when she hears that Scar is the one who's actually killed her parents, because Edward had found out about this, he was yelling at him, didn't realize Winry was there to hear it. But the next thing you know, she's picked up one of the discarded guns of one of the soldiers that Scar killed, and her hands are shaking, she's aiming it at him, and she's just on the verge of pulling that trigger and killing Scar herself. And Alphonse are immediately trying to talk her down. Never mind what move Scar might make in this moment, but Ed is really trying to talk her down. And Scar's he's just saying, well, I did kill them. You have the right to take my life if you want to. But, she's half listening to Ed. She's half thinking about still doing it. She's really vacillating in between the two. And Scar eventually is of the mind of, if you're going to kill me, then just kill me, because otherwise you're in my way. So he makes a dash at Winry, and Ed, gets right in the middle of it, just throws himself bodily, and is just going to do whatever it takes to protect her from Scar. And Scar actually pauses because he sees, Ed, who's at this point all of 15, just this 15-year-old boy just in front of this girl, bodily protecting her, last-ditch effort, and Scar's realizing that this kid would absolutely die to protect her. And so this does give Scar pause. And, after a few other distractions, Scar does run off. Alphonse chases after him, but it's Ed that stays to talk Winry off the final bit of that ledge, because she's still holding that gun and gripping on it. She's completely hysterical. She couldn't pull the trigger. She's upset with herself for that. And Ed is literally just peeling back her fingers one by one, saying that her hands were meant for healing, for giving life, for helping people, not for killing. And that's why she couldn't pull the trigger, and it's okay, because she wouldn't be who she really is if she had been able to do that. And it's a really beautiful but sad and tragic moment between the two of them. She finally lets go of it. He takes the weapon away, and she's just hysterical, and she's collapsed into tear, and Ed is holding her, wrapping her in his arms, putting his signature red cloak around her. And then he kisses her at the top of her head, and he sees some MPs coming, and he hands them over into their care, because he knows she will be safe before he has to go off and fight. But he's talking to her very softly, very gently, saying, Winry, I'm going to have to go fight. Scar's still in the field. I still have a job to do. I have to go back up Alphonse, and we've got to bring this guy in. I will come back. I will tell you the whole story when I get back. Everything's going to be okay. And, it's only once she's, reasonably stabilized in that moment that he actually is willing to leave her and go do what he needs to do. Now, Winry is still quite fragile at this point, and she's very frustrated because she's having to wait again, and she's so tired of trying to wait for people. She waited for her parents to come back from the war, and of course they never did. She's very afraid that, Edward and Alphonse really, but Edward more so, just because they could go off into a fight and then not come back, and she's just waiting, and she's doubting her usefulness. She's doubting her core purpose. She just does not like feeling this helpless. Now, once Ed actually rejoins Alphonse and starts fighting off Scar, he mentions that Winry's safe, but the main thing he's worried about at the moment is just that he's upset because he was the cause of her crying again. And he hates that. He hates seeing her cry. He hates seeing her sad or upset for any reason. So after that confrontation is resolved, the leader of Amestris, who's actually in league with the big bad of the story, he uses Winry and her safety as leverage against Edward and Alphonse, but specifically against Edward in an attempt to make sure that Ed is not going to interfere with, the grand plan. And down the road in the story, Winry is openly used as a hostage, and it took quite a bit to get her away from the Amestrian powers to where she was safe, and Ed had to go off and do other stuff. And you don't really see them reunited until much later in the story, almost to the conclusion. But by that point, you can already see that just something is there. Now, it was kind of a slow realization for both parties that there was something more there than just, childhood friends and caring for each other almost like you were family members. Winry's moment of realization came after Ed comforted her at just the worst low moment of her life. She was leaning on him emotionally, and then once she actually left town because her automail clients needed her, and she was feeling a bit renewed and invigorated because her work did have meaning, did have purpose. It mattered. She wasn't just waiting. She was someone who was waiting for something to be resolved, but still was active in helping other people. And that helped her pull herself together. But as she was going on that train trip, she was just kind of reviewing some things that had happened within fairly recent months within the story, and she asked herself if she had been falling for Ed all of this time. The thought came very gently. It was as a comfort, and by the next time she saw him, you could tell that she had made her peace with it. He was who he was. He was going to annoy her the way he was going to naturally annoy her, but she still had fallen for him, and she knew it, and she had accepted at that point. Now, Ed's revelation about his feelings towards Winry was not so gentle, which is to be expected because gentle. It's not that he's incapable of gentleness, but he does have a lot of aggression in his nature, and he's most aggressive towards himself. He holds himself very accountable to very high standards. He does not make excuses for himself. So whenever he's having to confront truth, it comes with all the force of a wall of bricks hitting him. At 70 miles an hour. One of the characters had made a casual remark that Ed is doing what he's doing because by this point in the story, it was more than just he and Al needed to get their bodies back and all this other stuff. There was just more at stake. There was more tied in. And this character had observed that, Ed did what he did because he needed to protect his loved ones. And then stated as a matter of fact you've got to protect Winry. You love her, right? And Ed freaked out, spat out coffee, and went straight into the state of nervous and anxious denial and rationalization and nervousness. It was just, no, that thought hadn't occurred to me, and I'm not prepared to face it now. Of course I'm going to protect her. We've known each other for years, and she's like a member of the family, and blah, 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 all the things you expect for someone of that age to suddenly realize that they care about someone a lot more than they thought they did, and the nature of that caring is romantic, and it's just hitting them full force. Didn't gradually wake up to it. Nope, it was just a pure Band-Aid operation, and poof, there he was. This is pretty understandable. Even, I think, the trepidation and I think even fear that it would be fair to say that Ed was feeling in that moment. Because think about his character. He understood responsibility after, his parents died. His father wasn't around. He was looking after his younger brother. It wasn't really so much a parent-child dynamic between them, but he was still more in a fatherly role. So he understood responsibility, he understood commitment, he understood instinctively what that sense of responsibility and commitment would mean in a romantic context, particularly with someone who meant as much to him as Winry does. But over time, he came to accept his feelings for her. He was able to integrate that into his consciousness, but it was already there. It was always unconscious before, and now it's actually on his conscious thought level. And you can see him interacting with her more so on that basis. They already were like this old married couple that were always, blah, 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 with each other over small little things. But it took on a slightly different tone. You can see that it's just, they're never going to get rid of each other. There's never going to be any rival for each other's affections. They're already completely in tune and tied in with one another. And while it wasn't the most graceful forms of acceptance, Ed eventually realized that this is where he is, and it is what it is. He was able to accept it as a fact, just like he was able to accept the laws of alchemy as fact. So ultimately, Ed and Winry are characters, they grew into each other as they matured. One of the reasons why their bond was so strong and so stable, was able to withstand, all the ups and downs of the story, is because the energy of their spirits had already been mingling for years and years. And it isn't that they fused into being the same person. It's simply that each carried a part of the other person inside of them. It forged a link. And out of that link grew something that was very organic, very natural, and it laid the foundation for the rest of their lives. So if we finally get to the point of where we are sealing the deal, it's the very end of the story. Ed and Winry are at the train station. He's traveling on an alchemy research project, and Winry is nagging him about how he needs to do maintenance on his automail leg, and he's not really paying attention. And then she says, "Oh, well, why am I telling you this? You'll be back in a month because you're not going to do anything I say anyway. You'll need an adjustment." And as he's about to board the train, she tells him, just, call ahead and make an appointment, before she could get to him and deal with his leg. And he just pauses in the threshold of that train, and he's just like, an appointment? And it's such an outrageous thing in his mind that he'd have to make an appointment to see Winry, or an appointment for them to deal with each other, or anything so formal of that kind. And you see him making this decision, saying, you're not my mechanic. You're not my mechanic. You're not my childhood friend. He understands the direction that their relationship really needs to take. Even though he's still going to go on his research trip, he knows what needs to happen. So he turns around nervously, points at her and shouts, because that's what he always does when he's nervous. And he says, "Equivalent exchange! I'll give half of my life to you if you give half of your life to me." Which, as proposals go, I don't think that ranks amongst the top 10 of most romantic either. But it was completely it was consistent with his character. Winry was so exasperated. It's just, why do you have to reduce everything to alchemy? I mean, what is wrong with you? And then she said, "Why don't I just give you my whole life?" And then there was cricket silence, and they were staring at each other, and they just realized what was just said. Ed was proposing. Winry was saying halfway was not enough, and then she starts, vacillating, like, "Oh, well, percentages, okay, 65, that's not enough, 80, 85, I don't know." And Ed starts laughing, and he was talking about how, everything she just said disproved one of the presumptions of alchemy, and she was aggravated with him, but in the end, the scene ends very happily. They're now an engaged couple. He's going to come back. They're going to get married. That's going to happen. And as the end credits roll, it shows a series of photos of the various characters going forward in time. And one of the big ones towards the end is a picture of Ed and Winry with, the gang that's become their family. And they were both holding two children. Clearly they were living happily ever after. So all's well that ends well. They were going to have the same dynamic that they always had. It actually reminds me quite a bit of my great uncle Gerald and my great aunt Vera. It's very familiar to that. And I have to say that the characters of Edward and Alphonse, they are pretty near and dear to my heart. When I made my husband watch this series with me, because I had seen it before, and then I realized, oh, he's going to love it. So I made him watch it with me. And I pointed out to him fairly early on in the story, I said, "You do realize that if we had had children, we probably would have had kids like Edward and Alphonse. You would have had Edward, who would have taken after me, hot temper and all. And then you would have had Alphonse, who was a little bit more calm and kind and rational." And he just started laughing because, he realized it was true. So I think that's one of the reasons why I got a little bit more invested in these characters in general, and also with the romance between Edward and Winry, just because, if that had been my kid, I would have been cheering on. Just, "That's my boy, of course." You found a nice girl who's going to keep you in line like you've always needed. Yay, and I'm going to have grandchildren. I mean, it's that kind of feeling. And that's what really good fiction should do. You should be able to see these characters, reflected, at least to an extent, to, people in your life or things that you would have had or wanted for yourself. It's about connecting the fictional to our concrete reality. And that's an important thing. It's what gives stories meanings. That's why we keep coming back to certain stories time and again. But to sum it up, between Edward and Winry, it's really a message about solidifying the bonds of home. And the idea that home is not just where you belong as far as a physical location goes, but it's who you belong with. Regardless of what was going on or anything else, Edward and Winry, they always belonged to each other, and you could see it. It was as if fate itself had matched them up since they were children, and it just happened naturally. There was a mutual and just full acceptance. They were each other's constants, so no matter what life was throwing at them, where either of them had to travel, how busy things got, whatever the obstacle was, really, it was always okay. When anytime you saw them reunited, it wasn't, oh, things have changed and I'm not sure. It was just they were almost picking up where they left off, because even though they were growing and maturing through the story, they were doing so at the same rate. So whenever they made up again, they were still able to have that same wavelength, that intuitive understanding of each other, and they were able to speak to each other on equal terms. And really, that's what led to the permanency of their relationship. It was those years and years of history, patterns of behavior, and just a sense of comfort. They were comfortable with each other. Even when they were bickering, it was very comfortable. It's like, okay, so we're bickering again about whatever it is we're bickering about. It's not a big deal. 2 seconds from now, we'll be on perfectly good terms. And that, and there's no doubt in my mind that you wouldn't, tear down mountains for me if that's what needed to happen. They had a sense of security, and I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think that's one way you can really make the old trope of friends to lovers actually work, to where it's very satisfying for the audience, and it's not a source of cringe, and it's not repeating patterns that just don't really come off well. So I think that's a good lesson, certainly for writing and storytelling, but I think it's also something that speaks to human nature itself. And that's really why I keep doing this particular series, looking for how romance is expressed within modern mythology. It's because, ideas of love and being a couple and coming together, building families, building communities, these are things we learn and relearn through each and every generation. And that is a magic all of its own. And because it's so core to how we live our lives, that has complete relevance and ongoing relevance to practitioners of the craft. We are co-creators of the universe with the work that we do. So thinking about how things can be created in such a way that they will last, how we can help patterns that are healthy carry on and continue, how we can better understand the nature of what it means to be human and how different people think. We need that all of the time, and I think this story is a really good exploration of a lot of different psychological elements of the human condition. If you've never watched the series before, I highly recommend it. It's really very strong. All of the characters are very individualized, and you just feel yourself understanding them and reacting to them as if they were people that you would meet on the streets. So, solid all around. I think that's it for today, though. I shall see you in another video.